Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm Sam Albanese of the National Weather Service. Today's weather around the state, well, this afternoon across the south central region, particularly the northern Cook Inlet up into the Susitna Valley, we did see some thunderstorm activity. Even got some reports from up in the valley along the Parks Highway near mile 58 of hail that was large enough to cause some windshields to crack. We are still expecting some thunderstorm activity through the evening hours, so that's something to be on the lookout for as we do continue to expect some hail up in the valley. Those thunderstorms went right on up into the interior, and they started kind of early today, so it was kind of unique in that sense. Taking a look now at our fire danger map, we still have some high fire dangers in the Copper River Basin, as well as up into the upper Yukon Valley, and also in the Seward Peninsula and up towards just north of the Kotzebue Sound region, as conditions are still a little bit on the dry side for those areas. They didn't benefit from the rain that most of us did see, especially in the Tanana Valley over the weekend. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery over the North Pacific, put the loop in motion, kind of see what's going on here. Here's a bit of a low pressure system, and then here's one that's forming down south of the chain. As we put the loop in motion again, basically this system's coming up. There's a warm front associated with that, but there's also going to be some winds in advance of that. But the big thing with this system is going to be more rain and even likely going to see some fog as this system rolls on up into the picture. In the Bering Sea itself, with high pressure over the eastern Bering Sea and portions of the Bering Sea, generally speaking, rather benign conditions. Some areas of fog and low clouds, especially over the Pribilof Islands, were prevalent throughout the day today. Taking a look now over the state of Alaska, and this area right here, as we put the loop in motion, this is where the convection was popping up. The thunderstorm activity in the afternoon hours went right on up into the Tanana Valley, across that Fairbanks area. Isolated type thunderstorm activity was occurring throughout this region early in the afternoon. Putting the loop in motion one more time. Along the North Gulf Coast, showers associated with what's left of this low pressure system that's been in the Gulf for quite some time, over towards southeast Alaska, as we had low pressure way down towards the Haida Gwaii area, pushing moisture on up into southeast Alaska. Rain was prevalent there. Today's weather map, here's what's left of our low pressure system, an occluded front that's basically been dissipating to a trough throughout the day. Rain in advance of that front coming into southeast Alaska, though it was tending to stay basically south of Juneau and along the outer coastal areas, all the way towards the North Gulf Coast, though Yakutat wasn't quite into the rain yet. Showers and rain throughout Prince William Sound. We did see the thunderstorm activity, as I was talking about earlier, through the south central region, up through basically from Anchorage north, right on up through the Susitna Valley into the Tanana Valley, at least the western portions of the Tanana Valley, and also over into the Canadian Yukon Territory. Back behind this low pressure system, along this boundary right here, basically a weak trough, some showery conditions from Iliamna north across the Kuskokwim Valley, over in the lower Yukon River Valley, also inland of the Seward Peninsula. And then we have our low pressure system sitting up off the Arctic coast just near Barrow, with a trailing cold front that was producing showers over the western Arctic coastal regions and the western portions of the Brooks Range. And then with the warm front to the east, some drizzle and fog or light rain was occurring across the eastern portions of the Arctic coast. Out into the Bering Sea, here's our weak low pressure system. This isn't the one that's of the concern. The one that's of the concern you can see in the satellite imagery to the south and west. This one is basically causing some rain over the central Aleutian Islands, cloudy conditions further to the east, and also back to the west towards Shemya. Some cloudy conditions, an isolated shower or two was seen out there today. By tonight, weak low pressure persists in the Gulf of Alaska. The occluded front dissipates to a trough, and basically expect rainy conditions to persist throughout southeast Alaska with this weak trough over the panhandle. Rainy conditions or showery conditions can be expected along the North Gulf Coast into that Prince William Sound area, more showery by the time you get to Prince William Sound. Some isolated thunderstorm activity can be expected in the evening over the Copper River Basin, continuing in the Susitna Valley, also along the Alaska Range on the west side of the range, right on up through the Kuskokwim Valley, into the central interior and the upper Yukon Valley, as well as in the Tanana Valley region. Expect some isolated thunderstorm activity in the Susitna Valley, possibility of some small hail continuing in that region. Further to the west, isolated to scattered shower activity over the western interior right on up to the central Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coast, numerous showers can be expected over the western Arctic coast, expecting things to clear out a little bit over the eastern Arctic coast, but generally partly to mostly cloudy conditions there. Weak high pressure in the eastern Bering Sea. Basically expect some foggy conditions overnight in the St. Paul, Pribilof Island region. Breaks in the clouds across the Alaska Peninsula. And as we move further to the west, we can see the warm front coming up into the picture. Rain with some fog can be expected over the central Aleutian Islands, not quite to the western Aleutian Islands. Out in the western Aleutian Islands, there's an outside chance you may see a shower or two. By Tuesday, we basically have high pressure over the Gulf of Alaska. The low pressure is all but gone, but onshore flow into southeast Alaska will keep the threat for some light rain continuing scattered throughout southeast Alaska. We also expect that there may be some showers over the south central region and Prince William Sound as an upper level feature is what's coming across this area, and that's going to trigger those showers. Isolated thunderstorm activities once again in the afternoon in the Copper River Basin up into the Tanana Valley and the upper Yukon Valley down into the central interior, and also down along the west side of the Alaska Range as you move on down towards Iliamna. Isolated thunderstorm activity is possible there. Some showers are possible in the Kuskokwim Delta region. Even in the Bristol Bay area you may see an isolated shower or two. Some foggy conditions on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula as well as the Pribilof Islands, mainly early on in the day. As daytime heating occurs, the fog should lift up a bit and burn off from the top down. Then out into the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, you can see our system coming into the picture. Here's the front coming up south of the eastern Aleutian Islands. Expect rainy conditions and somewhat breezy conditions to pick up from the eastern Aleutian Islands over to the central Aleutian Islands. And out into the western Aleutian Islands, expect some showers in the trailing trough behind this low pressure system. By Wednesday, low pressure over the interior, ridge of high pressure down in southeast Alaska. Southeast Alaska, expect breaks in the clouds, generally mostly cloudy conditions down there. Scattered shower activity over the south central region into the Copper River Basin and Prince William Sound. Some isolated thunderstorm activity along the west side of the Alaska Range can be expected with this trough of low pressure coming down from the interior. Scattered shower activity in the Tanana Valley with some isolated thunderstorm activity possible up along the eastern slopes of the Brooks Range in that upper Yukon Valley. Along the Arctic coast, with the high pressure over the Arctic, cloudy conditions should persist, some breaks inland over the northwest Arctic coast. Also likely going to see some fog overnight and into the morning, Tuesday night into Wednesday along the Arctic coastal areas. Expect some nice breaks in the clouds over the Kotzebue Sound down through Norton Sound to just over the Yukon Delta region during the day Wednesday, so some sunny conditions there. Down across the Alaska Peninsula, here's our low pressure system coming up from the south. Expect rain to spread across the Alaska Peninsula, continuing over the eastern Aleutian Islands, and with the trailing trough behind this low pressure system, some rain persisting over into the central Aleutian Islands. More likely that's going to be more of a showery type pattern there. And then high pressure ridge building into the extreme western Aleutian Islands. Generally cloudy conditions can be expected underneath that weak ridge of high pressure. Taking a look now at temperatures around the state today. Temperatures in the 50s throughout southeast Alaska to Prince William Sound, into the 60s as we come on up into the northern Cook Inlet region and basically Kenai North, into the Susitna Valley and the Copper River Basin. 60s to low 70s in the eastern interior, and 50s as we get on over to the western interiors to low 60s as we get on down to the Kuskokwim Valley. 50s throughout the Bristol Bay area. Up to the Arctic coast and Brooks Range. Along the Brooks Range, at least on the south side, temperatures are generally in the 50s until we get all the way over towards the eastern Brooks Range where we had temperatures into the mid-60s there. Along the Arctic coast, temperatures generally in the 30s and 40s, although in the Dead Horse area it has been rather warm, 61 degrees there. Seward Peninsula on the Kotzebue Sound side, 40s to low 50s, and same thing for the Norton Sound region, and 40s over in the St. Lawrence Island area with 40s over the Yukon Delta. To southwestern Alaska, along the coast of the Bristol Bay area in the 40s, 50s inland, 40s and 50s along the Alaska Peninsula. Sandpoint did get up to about 59 degrees today. 40s in the Pribilof Islands, mid-50s over the eastern Aleutians at Dutch Harbor, and temperatures across the Aleutian Islands out to the west stayed in the mid-40s today. For our lows tonight, expect southeast Alaska to generally be in the upper 40s to low 50s, mid to upper 40s over the south central region down the Kodiak Island, mid 40s to low 50s in the eastern interior, mid 40s to low 50s over the western interior to the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coast, temperatures in the 30s can be expected for your lows tonight. Over the Seward Peninsula and the Bering Strait region, 40s and upper 30s can be expected there. 40s down over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta to the Bristol Bay region, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutian Islands, Pribilof, as well as the remainder of the Aleutian Islands. Taking a look for highs tomorrow, expect temperatures generally in the 50s in southeast Alaska with the cloudy, cool weather persisting there. 60s over the south central region into the Copper River Basin, to the 70s over the eastern interior, upper Yukon Valley, right on down to the Kuskokwim Valley itself, at least the northern part of the Kuskokwim Valley and the western interior. 60s as you go further towards the coast. Bethel might even get near 70 tomorrow. 60s in the Bristol Bay region, 50s across the Alaska Peninsula, 50s also over the eastern Aleutian Islands, 40s in the Pribilof Islands and the central Aleutian Islands, as well as the western Aleutian Islands. For flying weather tomorrow, expect marginal conditions throughout much of southeast Alaska, except maybe the northern panhandle. See some VFR conditions there, and along the North Gulf Coast. IFR conditions hugging the coast of the Arctic coast with that high pressure up there. Expect some IFR conditions in that St. Lawrence Island area with marginal conditions over the majority of the eastern Bering Sea to the Alaska Peninsula, and IFR conditions across the eastern Aleutian Islands out to the western Aleutian Islands and the western Bering Sea. For our passes tomorrow, expect VFR conditions for Anaktuvik as well as Adigan Pass. Down to the Alaska Range, expect VFR conditions for both Lake Clark and Merrill Pass. VFR conditions for Rainy Pass as well. Up to Windy Pass, expect VFR conditions. VFR conditions for Isabel Pass as well as Mentasta Pass. Moving on down to the Chugach Mountains, Tonita Pass, expect VFR conditions, as well as Portage Pass VFR conditions. And then down in southeast Alaska, VFR conditions for both Chilkoot and White Pass can be expected tomorrow. Our freezing levels, basically about 6,000 feet over southeast Alaska to 8,000 feet as we move over to the eastern interior, around 6,000 to 7,000 feet over much of the western interior, right on up to the Seward Peninsula and the Arctic coast. 8,000 foot freezing levels over the Alaska Peninsula, as well as much of the Aleutian Islands, to about 7,000 feet over the western Aleutian Islands, with 6,000 feet over the northwest Bering Sea. For our icing tomorrow, expect some isolated moderate rime icing from your freezing level to about 18,000 feet, basically from Unamak Pass west to about Amchitka can be expected there. And then down in southeast Alaska, some isolated moderate rime icing can be expected from your freezing level to about 21,000 feet from in the Panhandle, basically south of Juneau. For our jet stream starts off at about 90 knots coming south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, accelerates to 110 knots south of the Aleutian Islands, drops off to about 75 knots as it comes across the Gulf of Alaska south of Kodiak Island, and then 45 knots as it makes landfall over that Vancouver Island area. Taking a look down at the 9,000 foot level, basically pretty light winds over southeast Alaska, around 15 knots. Very light winds over much of the interior, about 10 to 15 knots. Winds pick up a little bit as we get up towards the Arctic coast, about 20 to 25 knots along the eastern Brooks Range, as well as portions of the Arctic coast. And then as we move on over towards the Alaska Peninsula, 20 knot winds north of the peninsula, 40 knot winds coming up from the south, 20 knot winds coming on up towards western Kodiak Island. And then around our low pressure system out into the Aleutian Islands, about 20 knot winds around that low pressure system to 15 knots over the central Bering Sea, and 20 to 30 knot winds coming around the backside of that low pressure system. Taking a look down at the 3,000 foot level, down in southeast Alaska, generally pretty light winds, 5, 10 knots or so, associated with that ridge of high pressure over the eastern Gulf of Alaska, so pretty benign conditions there. Same thing for the North Gulf Coast, very benign conditions, about 10 knots there. Over the mainland, very light winds, 5 to 10 knots throughout much of mainland Alaska, right on up to the Arctic coast, where you're looking at about 10 knots of wind there. As we move on back towards our low pressure system out into the Aleutians, 25 knot winds coming across the Alaska Peninsula, about 20 knot winds coming across the eastern Aleutian Islands, and 20 knot winds out over the western Aleutian Islands. South of the central Aleutian Islands, right around the low pressure center, about 30 to 35 knot winds on the south side of the chain there. And in the Bering Sea itself, generally pretty light conditions, 10 to 15 knots or less can be expected in that Bering Sea region. That takes us to our turbulence chart for tomorrow. And here we're expecting some isolated moderate turbulence below 2,000 feet, basically over the eastern Aleutian Islands and the Dutch Harbor area to the central Aleutian Islands. That wraps up this portion of the show. Enjoy this segment and come back to the marine forecast.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of Alaska Public Media and Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, welcome to Hangar Flying. Our guest this evening is Dan Billman. Now, Dan's been on the program a number of times in the past. Dan is FAA flight standards, very experienced Alaska pilot. In fact, his flying goes all the way back to taking courses at West High. And he started a company called Alaska Air Ventures, and then he started a company called Hawaii Air Ventures, and as near as I can tell, it was designed so he could spend his winters in Hawaii and his summers in Alaska. Dan, welcome back. Talk a little bit about that sweet deal.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah, it was the best of both worlds. Our kids attended a private school on the Big Island of Hawaii, Hawaii Preparatory Academy, and it was just a real good opportunity for great education. And then we started, applied for an air taxi certificate, and then in the meantime I did some basic training, and primarily stall spin and basic aerobatic training. And that was real rewarding. We were involved in starting Experimental Aircraft Association chapter there as well.
Hey, you and I, Dan, have talked about the value of stall spin training. Some of the unfortunate shortfalls, I believe, is the fact that it's not required to get your private. In fact, it's not until you become a CFI that you're ever exposed to it. And yet, I think 40% of fatal accidents are caused by stall spin problems. So talk a little bit about the training that you offered and the value you see in it.
It was most rewarding for me. We would have there were a lot of pilots actually that came down from Alaska, and we would do at first just real intensive slow flight stall series, departure stalls, approach stalls, and then start working into stall spins. And then once we did plenty of spin training, then we would study recovery from spins as quickly as possible, detecting that the aircraft was going to spin and how soon you could recover. And most rewarding, a lot of people were never introduced to spins, as you mentioned, yet they're out there doing the turn around the moose and the maneuvering in tight areas in the mountains and whatnot, and just didn't have the feel they were probably pretty comfortable with most most stall series, but when it came to entering a spin, it's an abrupt maneuver for somebody that's never done it, and they'll often do everything wrong.
Did you find that a lot of people were really anxious and concerned about what it was going to be like in their first spin?
Oh, sure. There's so much hype about spins, and they are startling for the first time you experience them, and but they're actually a fun flight maneuver, and once you've done a few of them, they become old hat, just like departure stalls or approach stalls. So, and then also most important is other basic aerobatics, to be able to roll off your back, to be able to do slow rolls and emoluments and all those other basic sportsman type maneuvers are very helpful to a new pilot or any pilot.
So Dan, we've got about a minute and a half left. I want to ask you a question that I always ask my guests, and drawing upon your experience, what one thing would you say people could do that would make aviation safer in Alaska?
Well, there's always the question of weather. We know that weather causes a lot of accidents, but I would have to say loss of control of aircraft. And And again, it's in those areas where we're low to the ground, maneuvering, often in a Super Cub or a Bush type aircraft, and the aircraft loses control, enters a spin, and they're often fatal. So I think the most important thing is to go out and get with a good instructor with a parachute and properly certified gear, and do some of that stall spins training and or basic aerobatic training. It'll save your life.
Yeah. And I would add that if you're looking for somebody to teach you how to do it, find somebody that is really experienced in stall spin type of training.
Absolutely.
Not just your regular CFI off the block. So
a lot of our regular CFIs don't have a lot of experience at it. You know, we realize that. And I think, like you, I would like to see that we bring mandated spin training back into the private pilot test standards.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Dan, thanks
That's
for
me
being
talking, not
No,
the FAA.
well, yeah, but I think wise words.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for your effort in safety.
Well, I appreciate the thought. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. And until next week, fly safe.
Welcome back, and now let's get started with our marine forecast for southeast Alaska on Tuesday. Expecting generally pretty light winds in the southern inside waters, south winds about 10 knots. Up into the Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay area, expect your winds to increase to about 20 knots in the afternoon there out of the south. West winds 15 knots in the southern outside waters to southwest winds 15 knots as we move further north along the outside waters to southwest winds 10 knots along that east Gulf Coast. Taking a look at the area for Wednesday, expect your winds to be northwest to west about 15 knots in the southern inside waters, southeast to generally south in the central inside waters, about 15 knots. South winds 25 knots as we move on up to the Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay area. Expect your winds out of the southwest to west 10 knots in the southern outside waters to 15 knots as we move a little bit further north to the northern outside waters, and south winds 15 knots along that east Gulf Coast. Along the south central region for Tuesday, expect your winds to be light and variable in Prince William Sound. Southeast about 15 knots along the north Gulf Coast to north to east winds 15 knots south of the Seward area. South and east of the Barren Islands, expect your winds to be northwest about 15 knots. Variable winds in the Augustine area with south winds to southwest winds 10 knots up Cook Inlet. And around Kodiak Island, expect your winds to be pretty much light and variable on Tuesday. A little bit of change in conditions expected as we move on into, well, the header up there is wrong, but for Wednesday, generally light and variable winds along the north Gulf Coast over towards the Augustine area. Southwest winds about 10 knots in Prince William Sound. Southwest winds about 5 to 10 knots coming right up Cook Inlet, and southwest winds about 10 to 15 knots across Kodiak Island. Taking a look at the Alaska Peninsula waters, looking at the south side of the peninsula, southeast winds about 20 knots on Tuesday, east winds 25 knots south of the western Alaska Peninsula. In the Bristol Bay area, expect your winds to be out of the southeast about 10 knots, and then east winds 20 knots north of the western Alaska Peninsula region. Taking a look at the area for Wednesday, and again the header there is kind of messed up. South winds 10 knots south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula, 20 knots out of the southeast, south of the western Alaska Peninsula, with 20 knot winds out of the southeast north of the western Alaska Peninsula, and variable winds 10 knots in that Bristol Bay area. On Tuesday in the Aleutian Islands, expect your winds to be out of the east about 25 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands to 20 knots as we move to the west in the Nikolsky area, to northeast winds 20 knots over the central Aleutian Islands, 20 knot winds out of the north over the Amchitka area, and northwest winds 15 knots out towards the western Aleutian Islands in that Shemya area. Taking a look at the forecast again on Wednesday, and some reason I had some problems getting the right header on these. Winds are going to be out of the east to northeast about 20 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands on over towards the central to western Aleutian Islands, about 15 to 25 knots there. North-northeast winds about 15 knots over the central Aleutian Islands to western Aleutian Islands over towards Amchitka as well as towards the Shemya area. For the Bering Sea coastal waters, expect your winds out of the east at 20 knots across the Pribilof Islands. Light and variable winds over the outer coastal areas, well, right along the Nunivak Island area, and winds up towards the St. Lawrence Island, variable to 15 knots out of the west. St. Matthew Island, variable to 15 knots out of the east, basically weak low pressure circulation in this area. Taking a look at the area for Wednesday, and it looks like the winds are going to be more easterly over the Pribilof Islands, around 15 knots. Expect your winds to be out of the north-northwest 5 to 10 knots over the Nunivak Island region, and winds out of the south-southwest 10 knots from St. Matthew Island right on up to the St. Lawrence Island region. Taking a look at the forecast for the Arctic coastal region on Tuesday, expect your winds to be out of the north-northwest 10 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound to Cape Lisburne. Variable winds 10 knots just off Point Lay to 15-knot winds out of the west from Barrow to Dead Horse, with variable winds 10 knots out towards the eastern Arctic coastal waters. Taking a look at the area for Wednesday, generally expect your winds to be out of the north about 5 to 10 knots over the Kotzebue Sound right on up to Cape Lisburne. North-northwest winds 10 knots over by Point Lay. West winds 10 knots in the Barrow area, with northwest winds 5 to 10 knots, basically Prudhoe Bay to the east. Taking a quick look at our maps tonight, expect this low pressure system in the northern Gulf of Alaska, but more importantly, rather unstable conditions, thunderstorm activity in the Susitna Valley as well as along the Alaska Range, also into the Copper River Basin, right on up into the Tanana Valley region can be expected tonight. And in the Susitna Valley, there's also the expectation that you're going to see some small hail there. Rain in southeast Alaska to the North Gulf Coast by Prince William Sound can be expected. Up along the Arctic coast, generally some showery conditions over the western Arctic coast, cloudy conditions to mostly cloudy conditions over the eastern Arctic coast. And as our system is coming up south of the Aleutian Islands, expect rain to be spreading into the picture there. By Tuesday, rain is going to persist across the eastern and central Aleutian Islands with some showers out to the west. Foggy conditions in the morning hours in the Pribilof as well as the Bristol Bay area, and some showery type conditions over much of the eastern interior right on up to the Brooks Range. We're out of time for the show this evening. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.